November, contact Scottish Control 133.89. 33816
At 12:42 a.m. on the quiet, moonlit night of March 8, 2014, a Boeing 777-200ER operated by Malaysia Airlines took off from Kuala Lumpur and turned toward Beijing, climbing to its assigned cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Unfortunately, the flight never made to its destination, and everybody on that plane was never seen again. The flight had a total of 239 people on board, including 12 crew members and 227 passengers from 14 different nations. Following the flight's disappearance, Malaysia Airlines released the names of the passengers and crew based on the flight manifest, but it was later modified to include 2 passengers who were traveling with stolen Austrian and Italian passports. The captain, 53-year-old Zahari Ahmed Shah from Penang, who joined the airline as a trainee pilot in 1981. The co-pilot was 27-year-old First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, who was completing his final training flight with Flight 370. The day the flight took off, it was one of the 2 daily flights operated by the airline from its hub at Kuala Lumpur International Airport to Beijing Capital International Airport. 26 minutes after the flight took off, at 1:07 a.m., the flight's last automated position report was sent. At 1:19 a.m., the last voice transmission from the cockpit was sent to air traffic controllers. Quote, "Good night, Malaysian 370. Minutes after that, the plane's transponder stopped transmitting. The aircraft was eventually tracked by Malaysian and Thai military radar, which showed it was turning west and then north to the Andaman Sea. It was last seen by satellites above the Indian Ocean. About an hour after the flight was scheduled to land, Malaysia Airlines announced that the flight was missing. A search and rescue effort began shortly after the plane was reported missing, including a search of the southern part of the Indian Ocean. On March 24th, the Prime Minister of Malaysia announced that the flight was seemingly lost in the Indian Ocean with no survivors.
And regret that I must inform you that according to this new data, flight MH370 ended in the southern Indian Ocean.
Over the years, various pieces of the assumed missing flight have been discovered, including a wing flap found in Tanzania 2 years later in 2016, and a plane wing fragment was also found in Mauritius that same year. Nobody knows what really happened to the missing flight and its passengers. Now, let us enter theory time. The first theory is that the pilot of the flight, Zahari Ahmed Shah, flew a suicide route. Jeff Wise, an aviation journalist, suggests a theory involving MH370's pilot, Zahari Ahmed Shah, who was believed to have deliberately downed the plane. Shortly after 1 in the morning, Shah flew over the South China Sea and sent his final signal to air traffic control in Kuala Lumpur before entering Vietnamese airspace. Wise's conjecture follows. He suspects that Shah then prompted his co-pilot to leave the cockpit and lock its door. Then around 1:20 a.m., Shah turned off all the plane's electronics, causing it to go off radar, and directed the aircraft back towards the Malaysian peninsula. At this time, Shah is still by himself and his co-pilot remains locked out of the cockpit. It's believed that Shah began depressurizing the cabin, thus causing the emergency oxygen max to go down in the cabin. Unbeknownst to the passengers, Their masks were still useless as the plane's oxygen generators only worked for about 15 minutes. Shaw, however, wore a more sophisticated, long-lasting oxygen mask, which allowed him to continue flying the plane until its fuel ran out. After 6 hours of the flight, the plane's engine stopped running and Shaw dove the plane, killing everybody on board. Despite the plausibility of this theory, Wise was still doubtful about it. Quote, "It is worth pointing out that there have been a handful of cases of pilots who have decided to kill their passengers." End of quote. Wise said, quote, "But there's never been a case that someone has taken 6 hours to commit mass murder-suicide. I started to wonder, maybe it wasn't Zari after all." The second theory is that the aircraft crashed in the South China Sea. A group of online sleuths who go by as the Tomnoders use a satellite imagery platform called Tomnode to locate the plane's crash site. Sindri Hendry, a Tomnode volunteer, found bits of plane debris in the South China Sea and identified one piece as MH370's nose cone and another as its fuselage and tail. Hendry said, quote, "I literally cried because I knew someone had died there. Because I knew that was a part of the plane. That meant they were no longer alive. That wasn't the answer their family members were looking for." However, Malaysian authorities were convinced that MH370 flew a different route, northwest, towards the Malacca Strait. Henry also said, quote, "I knew that what we had in the South China Sea was the debris of MH370, and I was not going to sit around and not be vocal about that. I had already notified Tomnode that this debris existed, but I was never got acknowledgement that I tagged debris." End of quote. The third theory is that MH370 was hijacked by 3 Russian passengers. 4 months after MH370 had vanished in July, a second Malaysia Airlines flight called MH370 was shot down by Russian-controlled forces in eastern Ukraine, leaving no single soul on that plane alive. As a result, investigators speculated that Russian spies were involved in the disappearance of MH370. Inmarsat data also suggested that the plane flew north and crashed in Kazakhstan, a client state of Russia. Upon further investigation, Wise learned that 3 Russian passengers were aboard MH370. One of them was sitting about 15 feet away from the unlocked carpet hatch that led to the aircraft's electronics bay, where the plane's communication with the Inmarsat satellite could have been controlled. For another theory of Wise, he believes that the Russian passengers began their hacking operation around 1:15 a.m. when Shaw flew MH370 over the South China Sea. The passenger sitting near the plane's hatch was able to access the electronics bay thanks to a ruckus in the first class cabin, which distracted nearby flight attendants. Around 1:20 a.m., the plane was under the control of the passenger, who turned off all the plane's electronics, causing it to go off radar. The passenger then directed the aircraft back towards the Malaysian peninsula and depressurized the cabin. They also cut off the emergency oxygen systems for the pilot and co-pilot. Prior to the plane's suspected crash, the passenger turned the plane towards the northwest and tampered with the Inmarsat data, which showed that the plane traveled south instead. The fourth theory is that the flight was intercepted by 2 American AWACS. Florence DeChengi, an author and investigative journalist, proposed that MH370 was interrupted by 2 U.S. AWACS planes. MH370's cargo list noted that 2.5 tons of electronics, including lithium batteries, walkie-talkies, and accessories, were being carried in the plane. However, the cargo was loaded without being scanned, which caused DeChengi to believe that it contained highly sensitive U.S. technology. DeChengi also learned that 2 U.S. AWACS planes were spotted near MH370. The planes, DeChengi said, must have had asked Shaw to land so they could inspect the cargo, but he refused to do so, thus prompting the AWACS to shoot down MH370 over the South China Sea. There were a few naysayers to the Chinese theory, including adventurer Blaine Gibson, who found MH370 plane debris on La Reunion Island and in Mozambique. However, the Chinese theory reinforced Hendry's findings in the South China Sea. The fifth and final theory is that MH370 was abducted by aliens. 2 months after it had vanished, an international poll was taken and found that nearly 10% of Americans believed that aliens, or beings from another dimension, were involved in the vanishing.